The ultimatum that failed the demand arrived, wrapped in familiar language: burden sharing, fairness, responsibility among allies. But beneath the diplomatic varnish was something sharper, not a proposal, not a discussion, a demand designed to land hard, dominate headlines, and force a reaction. Washington framed it as a long overdue correction. On assertion that Canada, long sheltered under America's defense umbrella, would now be expected to recalibrate its role. The message wasn't meant to be handled quietly. It was meant to be seen. An ultimatum dressed as partnership. The expectation inside Washington was simple. Canada would panic. Ottawa would rush to microphones. Emergency summits would be called. Back channel talks would begin within hours. That's how pressure is supposed to work. None of that happened. Canada's leadership said nothing. No press conference, no rebuttal, no defiant speech to rally domestic opinion. Even seasoned political reporters were caught off guard by the absence of response. In an era where outrage cycles are measured in minutes, silence felt unnatural, almost suspicious. And while the media waited for a quote that never came, markets began to move. Currency desks noticed first. The Canadian dollar didn't weaken. It held. Defense and infrastructure equities didn't wobble. Capital didn't flee. Instead, quiet reallocations began. Subtle, technical, easily missed, unless you were watching order books instead of cable news. Investors weren't reacting to the demand itself. They were reacting to the lack of reaction. Because ultimatums only work when the other side believes it must respond. Behind the scenes, procurement schedules continued unchanged. Long-term contracts stayed in place. Cross-border supply chains didn't blink. The economic signals that usually follow panic spikes in hedging costs, sudden demand for dollar liquidity, never appeared. In Washington, unease replaced confidence. The leverage had been assumed, not tested. The demand had been calculated on the belief that Canada needed American protection more than America needed Canadian stability. But the markets were delivering a quieter verdict. The relationship was more balanced than the ultimatum implied. As days passed, the absence of fallout became impossible to spin. There was no concession to announce, no negotiation table to publicize, no victory lap to take. The threat had landed and then evaporated. What Washington underestimated was not Canada's capacity to pay, but its capacity to wait. By refusing to engage on the ultimatum's terms, Ottawa shifted the battlefield entirely. Power stopped looking like volume and started looking like insulation. The question was no longer whether Canada would comply, but why the demand had failed to move anything at all. And that realization cut deeper than any rebuttal. Because once a threat is issued and nothing breaks, the illusion of dominance breaks with it. In the end, the ultimatum didn't force submission, or it exposed a miscalculation, one the markets recognized long before the politicians did. It had been quietly repriced. Canada's calm broke the strategy. Escalation was supposed to force a response. When the initial demand failed to produce panic, the volume increased. Public statements hardened. Rallies, interviews, and social posts framed the issue in sharper terms. The message was no longer just about budgets or fairness. It was about loyalty, about who was carrying whom, about who would fold first when the pressure became visible. The assumption was simple: public pressure would succeed where private ultimatums had not. It didn't. Canada refused to engage in the theatrics. No counter-accusations, no televised outrage, no symbolic walkouts or dramatic declarations of sovereignty. Ottawa recognized the trap. A public argument would legitimize the escalation. Silence would drain it of oxygen. Instead, Canada's defense and finance officials went on with their work. Procurement schedules stayed intact. Joint exercises proceeded as planned. Existing defense commitments, already agreed to, already funded, were quietly reaffirmed through routine channels. Nothing new was announced, but nothing was withdrawn either. Stability, not defiance, became the signal. And to the outside world, it looked uneventful. To allies, it looked deliberate. Diplomats in Europe and the Indo-Pacific noticed who was steady and who was shouting. In private briefings, Canada's posture registered as reliability under pressure. While one capital escalated for leverage, the other demonstrated control. In alliance politics, that distinction matters. The U.S. narrative, however, depended on confrontation. Without a Canadian response, there was nothing to amplify, no soundbite to replay, no defined core to frame as weakness or provocation. Media cycles that thrive on conflict began to stall. Commentators repeated the same accusations, but repetition without escalation loses force. Even the language began to feel hollow. Burden sharing sounded less convincing when existing commitments were already being met. Claims of imbalance rang flat when no concrete disruption followed. The story required a crisis, but Canada refused to provide one. Inside Washington, frustration grew. Escalation is a strategy only if it compels movement. When the other side doesn't move, escalation turns inward. Questions began circulating not about Canada's behavior, but about the effectiveness of the approach itself. Allies weren't rallying, markets weren't reacting. The pressure wasn't transmitting, it was dissipating. What was meant to look like dominance began to resemble insecurity. Volume replaced substance, threats replaced outcomes, and without a visible concession, the public campaign lost its purpose. In geopolitical contests, strength is often measured by who can afford to stay quiet the longest. Canada could, by doing nothing publicly and everything quietly. It denied the strategy its fuel. No reaction meant no leverage. The escalation collapsed under its own noise, and in the end, the most decisive move wasn't a counter demand or a press conference. It was the refusal to play at all. The coldest move was doing nothing. When nine-tinded by B sounded like desperation, the demand was presented as leadership. From Washington's perspective, naming the number was meant to project clarity, decisiveness at scale. YN 9 by billion wasn't just a figure, it was supposed to be proof of seriousness. A leader sets terms. A leader draws lines. A leader tells allies what the future will cost. But outside the political theater, analysts heard something else. They heard urgency. Numbers that large don't just signal strength, while they signal timing pressure. They suggest a need to lock commitments in place quickly, before leverage erodes or circumstances change. Markets and defense analysts alike began asking the same question quietly: why now? Canada noticed. Ottawa didn't respond with outrage or concessions. It didn't contest the number or accept the premise. It simply read the signal and waited. In negotiations, urgency is information, and the side that doesn't share it holds the advantage. There was no counteroffer. No formal rejection, no alternative framework floated to appear cooperative. Canada didn't even acknowledge the demand as something requiring an answer. Existing arrangements continued uninterrupted, as if nothing new had been put on the table. That continuity spoke volumes. Defense planners kept schedules steady. Diplomatic channels remained open but unhurried. Canada's posture suggested confidence not in its ability to resist pressure, but in its ability to outlast it. The absence of movement became a mirror reflecting the imbalance in need. In Washington, the stillness became uncomfortable. Officials began searching for ways to reassert initiative. Messaging shifted. The demand was reframed as an opening proposal, not a red line. Surrogates hinted at flexibility. Back-channel conversations probed for engagement that never quite materialized. The urgency that had been concealed by a bold number now surfaced in the follow-through. When strength sets a demand, it waits for compliance. When urgency sets a demand, it circles back, explains, clarifies, and adjusts. Observers could see the difference. So could allies. What had been intended as a demonstration of authority began to look like a reach and attempt to force resolution rather than shape it. The louder the insistence became, the clearer it was that time, not principle, was driving the push. Canada didn't exploit the moment. It didn't press for advantage or publicly expose the shift. It didn't need to. By maintaining continuity, it allowed the contrast to sharpen on its own. One side was trying to close a deal, the other was comfortable letting it remain open. The backfire, no one announced, there was no moment to point to, no press conference where Canada rejected the demand, no televised exchange of accusations, no dramatic rupture that could be replayed in clips or framed as a turning point. Officially, nothing happened. That was the problem. The ultimatum was never answered because it was never acknowledged. Defense timelines moved forward exactly as they had before. Procurement schedules remained intact. Joint planning meetings occurred on schedule with the same participants and the same agendas. On paper, cooperation continued uninterrupted, giving Washington no procedural hope to escalate or declare noncompliance. But expectations were quietly unmet inside policy circles. There had been an assumption that pressure would produce a visible adjustment, an accelerated commitment, a revised figure, a symbolic concession that could be claimed as progress. None appeared. The status quo persisted, and with it, the realization that the demand had failed to change behavior. That failure didn't trigger a response, it simply lingered, or media outlets chased a confrontation that never arrived. Commentators predicted retaliation, counter demands, or alliance fractures that refused to materialize. Without a flashpoint, the story lost energy. Headlines softened, coverage thinned, the issue slid from urgency to background noise. What looked like restraint was, in effect, resolution. By declining to engage publicly, Canada closed the loop without ever saying so. The absence of reaction removed the demand from the cycle of escalation. There was nothing to negotiate because nothing had been opened, nothing to reject because nothing had been formally received. From the outside, it appeared as though the issue had stalled. In reality, it had ended. Within Washington, the backfire became apparent only in retrospect. The moment to extract leverage had passed while attention was elsewhere. Without a crisis, there was no justification to keep pushing. Without movement, repetition would only expose diminishing returns. The deal didn't collapse, it expired. This was the cost of misjudging the terrain. Pressure strategies rely on friction, on resistance that can be shaped, amplified, or broken. When friction never appears, pressure dissipates. The energy spent doesn't convert into outcomes. It won by refusing to say anything at all. That refusal forced time to do the work. What had once been framed as a decisive demand became just another unrealized expectation. There was no announcement to mark the end, no declaration of failure, no official walkback, just a quiet shift felt only by those who had anticipated a result that never came. In the end, the backfire wasn't dramatic enough to be covered. It didn't generate outrage or applause. It generated silence. And silence is difficult to explain in headlines, but it was decisive all the same. Because by the time America reacted, adjusted, or reconsidered, the moment had passed. In high stakes diplomacy, that asymmetry is decisive. The party that can wait defines the pace. The party that can't reveals itself through repetition, explanation, and escalation. By the end, the 950 billion figure no longer sounded like leadership. It sounded like a signal, one Canada had read correctly from the start. Because in the end, it wasn't the silence that spoke the loudest. It was the demand itself. Demanding more revealed who needed the deal. Allies watch, power shifts, the ultimatum was never just about Canada. In alliance politics, no exchange happens in isolation. Every demand, every escalation is observed, not only by the country on the receiving end, but by every partner who might one day face the same pressure. When Washington raised its voice, NATO capitals listened closely. What they saw wasn't confrontation, it was contrast. Trump's framing cast the demand as leadership within the alliance, a corrective to what he described as years of imbalance. The implication was clear: those who didn't comply would be named, pressured, and publicly challenged. It was a test case, whether intended or not. Canada's response, or lack of one, set the tone. Instead of matching volume with volume, Ottawa chose restraint. It didn't question alliance principles. It didn't threaten withdrawal or reduction. It simply continued to meet its commitments without acknowledging the spectacle built around them. To allies accustomed to volatility, that steadiness stood out. Quietly, respect followed. In European capitals, diplomats noted that Canada hadn't flinched. It hadn't been rushed into symbolic concessions or defensive rhetoric. In internal assessments, the episode was read as a demonstration of confidence. Confidence that alliances are sustained by consistency, not coercion. Meanwhile, Washington's pressure tactic began to lose credibility. Ultimatums depend on predictability, apply pressure, provoke reaction, extract movement, but when the reaction never came, the tactic lost its edge. Allies began to question whether public escalation actually produced results or whether it simply revealed the limits of leverage. That question matters. Future negotiations are shaped by precedent. If pressure fails once, partners assume it can fail again. The lesson absorbed across NATO wasn't that demands would stop, but that they could be endured. That silence, under the right conditions, was not weakness but insulation. Canada didn't claim a victory, it didn't need to. The recalibration happened elsewhere. In subsequent discussions on defense spending, procurement coordination, and burden sharing, tone subtly shifted. Conversations moved back behind closed doors. Language softened. Numbers became more flexible. The performative edge dulled. On, and not because Washington announced a change, but because the audience had learned something. Power expressed through volume invites resistance. The episode reshaped perceptions in ways no communique could. Canada emerged as a stabilizing actor, predictable, disciplined, unshaken by theatrics. The United States, by contrast, appeared louder but less certain, more insistent but less persuasive. In alliance systems, that distinction accumulates over time. Influence isn't measured by how loudly demands are made, but by how often they're accepted without being forced. And credibility isn't built by escalation, it's built by demonstrating that escalation isn't necessary. As allies recalibrated their expectations, one truth became harder to ignore. Power isn't volume, it's restraint.